where we try to get interesting speakers and have a collaboration between U.S. and American institutions, but talk everything else but bilateral U.S.-Japan relationship.
Right.
And this is our total of the fourth or fifth, but actually the third for this year. And I thought that because we're doing this at the end of the year, it would be most fitting to kind of reflect on the first year of the Trump presidency and how foreign and national security policy may or may not have evolved around the globe. We have a great lineup of speakers, as you can see. Starting immediate to my left is Mr. Dan Twining. He's president of the International Republican Institute, the job that he recently took on. And before then, he was a counselor and director for the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund, where they did a lot of interesting collaboration with a European and Japanese institution. Next to Dan is Ellen Laipson, my former boss and now a distinguished fellow and a president emeritus of Stimson. And the farthest from me, not because I wanted to sit farthest from him, but just the way it is Mr. Kuni Miyake. I would call him my boss in Tokyo. He's a research director at the Foreign Policy and National Security Unit at the Canon Institute of Global Studies, who actually came up with this idea that it'll be probably fun to do a collaborative event where we don't have to talk about base, we don't have to talk about host nation support, none of that. So this will be in an hour, so it will be more of a conversational style. So what I would like to do is to first throw the opening question to all of our three guests here this morning, and then see how it goes. So to all of you, now we have seen the foreign policy and the national security policy evolved under the Trump administration since it was inaugurated in January. And what's your thought on this when you reflect back this past year? I would first start from Kuni, who traveled farthest amongst us all to get here. So, Kuni.
Thank you. This is the fifth, probably, of its kind. I never wanted to have a meeting like this, of the Japan-U.S. people for the Japan-U.S. people by the Japan-U.S. people. I never wanted that kind of meetings anymore for years. So today, I don't talk about Japan-U.S. relations at all. I try not to. Rather, I want to talk about U.S. policy vis-a-vis Europe, and U.S. policy vis-a-vis the Middle East, and in addition to U.S. policy vis-a-vis Asia. Let's start with the European theater. Russiagate scandal, I don't know how far it could go, but the European theater is not stable. I mean, the U.S. policy vis-a-vis Europe is not successful to the best of my knowledge. The Europeans don't like your president, and well, to me, it's not as stable as it used to be. And in the Middle East, it's much worse. And I was totally appalled by the decision to recognize that city as a capital. Ellen, we were together. I was here back in 1991, 1992, 3, when the Oslo process started. Your colleague Martin Indyk called me, and hey, we're going to have a ceremony to sign a new document, Oslo. Then they were inviting the Japanese Prime Minister. So Japan was, not the Japan-U.S. context, but Japan was one of the founding members of the peace process multilaterals. And we have participated. We participated in many, many meetings in Washington and elsewhere. So we are part of the peace process, but the peace process is dead, almost. I was speechless when I heard the news. So I don't want to go into details because you have some more comments to do, and I would like to talk about the U.S. Asia policy in general, relatively speaking, as compared to other theaters, Europe and the Middle East, Asia is relatively better off. I'm not saying that it is perfect. I'm not saying it's successful completely, but as compared to other areas, we witnessed relatively stable policy making, and to my surprise, Japan might have contributed at least to that process. It's amazing. I have followed the bilateral relations for decades, but I never seen things like this in the past. But having said that, we are a bit concerned about the, what should I say, policy debate, to put it mildly, inside the U.S. Trump administration, the White House. There are three elements I see. One is the America First element. Number two is the basically traditional foreign policy establishment thinking. And in terms of Asia, there are two schools of thought. One is, well, maybe we should reassure China. No, we should reassure the allies. It seems to me that the latter is seemingly dominant now, but therefore, Mr. Trump's visit to Asia was a relative success, I guess, but it doesn't mean that things are going to continue. We really don't know how the game plays out in the White House. And finally, I'd like to touch upon a little bit about my country, not a Japan-US context, but as you know, maybe in the last meeting like this, I referred to the Star Wars movies. And today we will see, I will miss it, but the Last Jedi, right? Is that right?
We're going after this, right?
Yes.
We're all going.
We're going. Okay,
We're going.
we should go. I mean, 6 months ago, I was talking about it's not the force, but the dark side awakens. And I said it's not the empire strikes back, but the empire's striking back. And number three, it's not the phantom menace, it's a nuclear menace. That's how I see the world. And unfortunately, the dark side is everywhere. In this country, in Europe, in Asia, including Japan. But I might have told you before, but because of Shinzo Abe, we've been successful in controlling the dark side in my country. I don't know how long it lasts, but as long as he is in power, things could be under control. Because he's a very, very patriotic conservative politician. But having said that, the question is, what's going to happen after Shinzo Abe? And look what's happening to Germany. Look what's happening to France. So I am personally concerned about the post-Shinzo Abe administration, post-Shinzo Abe era in my country. Who's going to control the dark side in my country, in addition to controlling the dark side in the United States and Europe, and the Middle East as well. So that concludes my first presentation.
Thank you. So from Asia to maybe I go to the opposite end, which is probably the things we're most volatile, which is Middle East. And Ellen, that's your game. So.
Yeah, well, thanks, Yuki. And it's delightful to be with Kuni again. We worked together in the mid-'90s on Iran as well as other Middle East issues. So, but I thought I would take your big question, which is kind of how do we assess the trends in the Trump administration and their impact on the large Eurasian landmass everywhere from the Middle East to East Asia. And I thought it is hard to come up with a single unifying theme of whether sort of the mainstream foreign policy establishment has successfully avoided the worst of some of the unpredictable and uncertain swings of the Trump administration, or are we in a period of sort of sustained volatility, uncertainty, waiting for the president to throw out some of his provocative ideas because he measures his own success as being an agent of change. He doesn't want to be sort of sucked into the establishment trend, you know, the pre-existing formulas of how the United States should manage its relations in Asia. He wants to be, I think, measures his own success in how much has he been able to disrupt and change things. But I think if we look at the big issues in Asia and the Middle East, it's a mixed picture, and what we are seeing is, you know, certainly the Jerusalem decision or even the Iran nuclear agreement, there's a lot of drama and perception that things are swinging wildly in one direction, but in reality, the institutions of national security manage for both legal and procedural reasons to avoid a total collapse of existing regimes and existing order. So while the president made this very provocative Jerusalem statement, he also signed the waiver again that we're not going to move the embassy quite yet. So he sort of wants to have his cake and eat it too. And I think that's what we've seen on the Iran agreement, that he was looking for a zone where he could, you know, explain that he had done what he said he was going to do, which is convey a deeper mistrust about Iranian intentions, find a way to link the nuclear agreement to Iran's regional behavior that we find very destabilizing, disruptive, et cetera. But in fact, he still avoided pulling the plug on the nuclear agreement entirely. And I think there has been a lot of pushback from European allies and from Asian allies that have said, you know, if you walk away, we will do everything we can to preserve this agreement, because we believe this agreement is still a net positive for both regional security and for global security. But I think we should take the North Korea crisis as another way to measure how much are we in new territory and how much are we kind of managing an acute long-term foreign policy challenge, and whether President Trump's attempt to set a very different style and a different way of signaling and messaging to the North Korean regime, whether that's in fact the prevailing dynamic, or we saw Secretary of State Tillerson at the Atlantic Council 2 days ago take you know, a very moderate approach, saying we're open to talking without preconditions. We, of course, need you to stop taking yet new measures in your nuclear program, but absent that, we can talk. Quickly disavowed by the White House, saying that's really not our position. Our position is to keep pressure on. We don't want to give the impression that we're softening our you know, position on North Korea. And so you were left with this feeling of, you know, does Tillerson kind of want to get fired? Was he looking for a way to say, you know, how do I get myself out of my misery? And maybe if I pursue you know, a completely reasonable policy on North Korea, that will be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and it may play out that way, we don't know. But there's that tension between whether the president himself seems to believe that the coercive approach to North Korea, lots of psychological pressure, lots of use of coercive diplomacy, is the way to go, and yet the underlying institutional structure of our national security policy making still doesn't want to cut off the diplomatic route quite yet. So I think that captures, in a way, this predicament of, you know, who's right? I mean, which of these different approaches is the prevailing one? And I think we're going to continue to live with this pattern of a very independent, self-driven, and not always deeply, you know, knowledgeable president who believes that by sheer force of personality, he can change dynamics in international crisis zones, but yet there's still this kind of institutional substructure that says, actually, we have pre-existing obligations to our allies, we have pre-existing enduring interests that have to be managed, and we don't have the luxury and I think the president is learning that there are, in fact, limits and constraints to presidential power. China is another one that I think is very important. The administration is congratulating itself that it has reconfigured the bilateral relationship from what had been several dozen bilateral committees and processes down to 4 high-level strategic dialogues. And I think many people on the Democratic side would also agree that the relationship had gotten almost too cluttered and that there was some useful house cleaning in streamlining the high-level dialogues with China. But this is also a moment where Xi is ascendant. Xi's control within his own country and the perception of Chinese power and influence on the global stage is an upward sloped graph, and the U.S. by comparison is bumping along with probably the secular decline of American power and influence, both in relative and absolute terms. And this is not all about the Trump administration. This is about big geopolitical shifts that were underway even before President Trump got elected. So, and then if we turn to Russia, similar to China, a kind of more textured understanding that while the president may have believed that at the leadership level, all that really matters is that the two leaders get along, but in fact, there's many other competing dynamics in these relationships. And in Russia, we now have most of the establishment, including some Trump political appointees, generally acknowledging that Russia is more an enemy than a friend right now, that if you look at all the issues, but yet we still have to find a few discrete areas in which we can pursue cooperation with Russia. The Syria crisis, the Syria civil war, is a startling example of the United States essentially ceding to Russia a leadership role, and that has quite powerful consequences for America's role in the Middle East more generally, because I think what we're seeing popping up in lots of places is countries that are uncertain about America's staying power or uncertain about America's commitments are opening up, more important conversations with Moscow. I mean, when we see Turkey, a NATO ally, wanting to be part of a new configuration with Moscow and Iran, where this is a topsy-turvy world, where some of the assumptions of where does the United States sort of find its close friends and partners, the Russians have been able to cut across our bow and introduce some new dynamics in that region in particular. So let me just finish up with some reference to a piece that Hal Brands has done in the new issue of the Washington Quarterly of whether we can see Trump's America First doctrine slightly shifting in a more moderate or conventional direction. And he says, as a best-case scenario, what you could see of the America First philosophy is free trade with a bite. So we're going to be tougher on trade issues, sharper elbowed alliance management. So we demand more of our allies, but we still want alliances in theory. A military buildup for both self-defense and collective defense, and a very important cooperation with Muslim countries to defeat jihadism. So that's the kind of counterterrorism piece of it. So it's a messy and confusing picture, Yuki, I think, where we can't sum up in one bumper sticker where we are, but I think we have to, brace ourselves for this continued volatility between what the national security establishment is trying to do to promote some stability in what we call the liberal international order versus a president who really enjoys, I think, being a source of disruption, questioning the assumptions of the old way of doing things and looking for ways to assert a different kind of American leadership. Let me stop there.
Finally, Dan, talking about the agent of change, your institution do a lot of work in the resiliency and the democracy across the globe. And from where you sit right now, from IRI, how do you see how the Trump administration and what their major foreign policy decision may or may not affect what you're trying to do. Because one of the things that we hear a lot nowadays is that this administration really doesn't talk about values and universal values like basic human rights as much as past administrations when it comes to upholding the democratic values realm. So with that intake and whatever else that.
Thanks, Yuki. Good. So I'm happy to go last because I'm the optimist here, relatively. And perhaps this just reflects my academic training. I don't think great tectonic global forces are determined by individual leaders, particularly. So what I'm interested in is the fact that North America is energy independent and the extraordinary potential that gives us to shape the coming century, really, right? Because this is most countries' Achilles heel, including China, including Japan in different ways, obviously. That's one. Obviously, the demographic story, the rise of India, I think is going to be the most exciting country story of the next 30 years, just like the rise of China was the most exciting country story of the last 30 years, propelled by demographics and youth. Similarly, in Africa, I think we're looking at an African century. Thank you. I think we're looking at an African century in which, you have this huge population explosion. You have 2/3 of a continent looking ahead of 2 billion people, looking out at 2050. That's going to be young and vigorous, and I don't think there's any cultural reason Africa cannot have its own economic miracle, like Asia had an economic miracle over the past 30 years. So there are these big forces in the world. And everywhere I go in the world, particularly overseas, all I do is look at TV when I'm in the gym and I see Donald Trump. And in my job now, I go up to Capitol Hill almost every day. So I'm going to see Bob Corker today. I saw Jim Lankford yesterday in the Senate. I saw Todd Young the day before. I saw Nancy Pelosi last week. So on both sides, right, of the aisle. And I'm just really encouraged by the support for American leadership and alliance projection and the role of our values in propelling our interests that we see in the Congress. And I think there is a very narrow focus in the world on our president, which misunderstands the nature of American power, the nature of American institutions, and the foundation of American leadership, which I really think is a lot less about who sits in the Oval Office. So it's not to diminish the president or try to change the subject. It's just to say that we need to take a more textured view here. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, people, I think, do occasionally find what the president says unconventional. What he tweets, what he says in prepared speeches, what he says in ad hoc remarks. I'm struck by the fact that President Obama gave great speeches about things like this pivot to Asia. And what we saw, I was in Asia a lot during the Obama years, we saw China take over the South China Sea. We saw China push out in ways no country has pushed out in Asia since Imperial Japan, right? So I think we should distinguish between what any president says and what any administration does. And I think that's a good rule. That's not just like the Trump era. That's just a good rule when you were trying to understand America, right? Because the speeches, I don't think, get you very far. I heard there was great stuff about a Russian reset in 2009 and lots of happy talk. I was living in Tbilisi, Georgia. The Russians invaded Ukraine, right? That was a historic setback for European security. In the entire post-Cold War era, that had not happened. Somebody pushing towards the core of Europe and the NATO alliance that way. So I think we should be honest. I also heard President Obama talk a lot about Iran and a new relationship with Iran. And what we ended up with is an Iran that is hegemonic in 10 countries in the Middle East, that is obviously a highly revisionist, aggressive, assertive power that is responsible for the deaths of thousands of American and European and other forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. Jim Mattis, before he was Secretary of Defense, said at a Canon Institute event that Bashar al-Assad would have fallen from power in 2012 if it had not been for the battlefield reinforcements he got from Iran. So I'm glad the Obama administration had this focus on the nuclear agreement. That's perhaps appropriate with respect to Iran's nuclear capabilities. But I think we were just struck from the start of this year at the extraordinary advances really a highly revisionist and hostile Iran had made, which is, by the way, why almost 2/3 of the Senate did not support the Iranian nuclear agreement, which is why it's not a treaty, which is the problem, is that any president can then reverse it because it's not a treaty. So I don't want to go on and on about this, but I would like to say a word about the new national security strategy, which the administration is releasing on Monday. I've been with H.R. McMaster in small group settings twice this week to hear him talk about it. This is quite an interesting document. Its elements include enhancing American influence, projecting building economic prosperity, really much more aggressively taking on revisionist authoritarian powers and protecting the homeland against extremists, terrorists, starting at the source. Not protecting the homeland by building a Fortress America, but protecting the homeland starting at the source. These are, objectives that I think most Americans would agree with. I would say, I think the administration could take it one step farther and focus on the fact that really all of our security challenges, from North Korea to extremism in the Middle East, to Russia and China building new spheres of influence, all those security challenges relate to governance, right? The threats come from dictatorships, they come from ungoverned or misgoverned states, and I think we should be candid when we talk about kind of the role of our universal values in shaping our security interests and outlook, and that's not just true for America, that's true for Japan and all of our friends and allies. I think this administration could go a little further in acknowledging that the absence of universal values and freedoms are a core driver of jihadist ideology, of revisionist great powers pushing out, of acute security dilemmas posed by places like Iran and North Korea. So finally, I will stop. I do want to say a word about North Korea. To his credit, President Obama, in their handover conversation, said to President Trump, Mr. President-elect, my administration dropped the ball on North Korea. I don't know if he used those terms. We did not, we did strategic patience, which arguably was kicking the can down the road. You can't do that. North Korea's weapons capabilities have gotten far too advanced. You need to take this on. And I think it is to this administration's credit. This is the hardest problem in international politics. We all know. We don't need to go into why. This is a puzzle that is very difficult to solve. But I think it's to this administration's credit that, frankly, I think the principals have had more focus on Asia in the last year, really on North Korea, than, frankly, I think the principals did in the entire second term of the Obama administration when they were saying great things about this pivot. So I think we should give them some credit for taking on this very tough problem in world politics, because it's not something that we can let another 4 or 8 years go by without addressing very directly. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think now that everybody had their initial remarks, if any of you had anything that they
Yeah.
want to ask each other,
I
would
intentionally avoided
start
the North Korean issue for the second half of the discussion. But I will repeat what I've been telling my audience in Tokyo about North Korea. And before that, I'd like to echo Dan's remarks. I'm still optimistic about the power of the United States. It's not declining. But I'm pessimistic about the U.S. leaders, political leaders. What is declining is not, I'm saying in Tokyo, is not the power of the United States itself. Power or ability, declining is the ability of the American political leaders to make the best use of, properly use the power of the United States. So that is in question. And a North Korean issue, the handling of the North Korean issue is symbolic. Everybody's watching you. In Europe, as you know, in the Middle East, how the United States keeps its promises, or commitments of the security alliance. So that's why I'm very much focused, worried about, or concerned about your handling of North Korea. And it's not only the Japan-US relations, but it's just the entire stability of East Asia is at stake. And the following is what I'm telling my audience these days. First of all, America may not wish to go to war in the Korean Peninsula for good reasons. And preemption is difficult. Militarily, it's not easy. And then South Koreans do not want to go to war anyway because they don't want to be ruined. They don't want to be scorched. Chinese don't want to give up on North Korea easily. I don't think they will stop the oil supply anyway. But even if they did, the smuggling is everywhere. And North Koreans are not provoking at all. Provocation means when the stronger of the two encourage the weaker to do something stupid so that the stronger can destroy the weaker. That's provocation. The weaker side will not provoke the stronger. It will only give the stronger side a justification to destroy the weaker. So North Koreans are not provoking. They are just trying to demonstrate their position of power. And they want to survive, I'm sure. So in the long run, all those four powers, as long as they behave rationally, there will be no war. But unfortunately, the history of mankind is the history of miscalculation. So that's why it could happen at any moment. So how long will it last? Until the last minute. The last minute, or the moment of truth, I mean. Moment of truth means that when North Koreans possess nuclear warheaded ICBMs. That will change the entire game. Then that will be it's not East Asian security issue anymore. It is an American homeland security issue. And it's an issue of the American right to self-defense. So it could happen at any moment. So I'm a bit concerned. If it had been 1994, it could have been much easier. But you cannot do that in 2017. So what's your take on this?
Well, I wanted to pick up on the point you made, Kuni, on the distinction between American power, which you see as an enduring truth, and the disappointing performance, if you will, that American leaders may not be utilizing that power. I guess I want to believe that it's true, that the attributes of American power and strength in the international system is an enduring truth. But I think if you don't exercise it competently, it does erode. I think that part of perception of power is not just the physical manifestations of power. We will retain our dominance as a military power that is unequal to, with no peer competitor. But economically, we have peer competitors. We have, the system is a little more dynamic than it's been in the past. And I do think that power there's some aspect of power that's intangible and that it does atrophy if you don't use it well. So I do think that there's the America First logic, which, I think obviously this was a appeal to American voters, does have a cost to it about whether it looks like we will dedicate enough resources and time and attention to that management of the international system versus, looking at what's in our own more immediate interest. So I guess I'm pushing back a little bit on your distinction between power as an enduring quantity and the leaders not being able to use it well, and saying that if they can't use it well, the power itself actually erodes.
And what's your take on it?
No, I agree with you, absolutely. One of the pillars of this new national security strategy, and I heard it come straight from General McMaster, is that, and forgive me because they have more of a partisan lens than I do perhaps, but said that really we've ceded too much of the balance of power to our competitors over the last 8-10 years, right? And we want to swing the balance back. So this is quite interesting because your point about the management of the international system, the competence in our execution, I think that's all right. They are quite focused in managing the international system in a certain way. It's very much more self-referential with respect to America rather than the liberal world order. I like the free and open Indo-Pacific. Maybe we should call it the free and open world, following Shinzo Abe, if we don't want to talk about the liberal world order. America is so superior in military power. We have a toolkit of power and influence, and the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines are only 10 or 20% of it, and the rest of it is development assistance, democracy work, broadcasting, our way of life. our technology companies. I mean, the fact that everyone has something in their pocket that essentially was created in America in the digital platform space. There is so much influence we can wield outside of our military power and outside of our government. And so I think every administration, as they come in, there's certainly a learning curve. And over time, you come to understand all the elements in the toolkit. And so many of them are not military. And frankly, to take on challenges like China's Belt and Road and, the subversion of free and open societies due to influxes of authoritarian capital, if you want to call it that. The response to that is not a military response, right? The challenge in Ukraine, yes, there's a challenge in Ukraine posed by Russian-sponsored rebels and Russian occupation of Crimea. But the challenge in Ukraine is really about creating a system of governance that can project that country towards Europe, towards the West, which is where its people want to go and get away from corruption and oligarchies and all of these things. So, I think when we take a nuanced view of American power and influence, we need to think about the whole toolkit. And that's something I think every administration learns on the job. And, everybody gets some things right and some things wrong.
Great. I think before opening up the floor to the question, my last question to you all three is, with that, hearing from all of you, I come to the sense that it's point number one. It's hard to generalize, and distilling everything that happened this past year in a bumper sticker. It's going to be a mixed picture. It continues to be a mixed picture, and now that in our country, 2018, we'll have midterm elections. So there's going to be a debate shift. There are going to be some debate shifting around that as well. So looking toward 2018, 2019, if you have the crystal ball and can say, okay, here are the major issues that we all need to keep our eyes on, what would those be? And then I think reversing the order, I'll start from you, Dan.
Oh, I was needed time to think about it. So, I think there's some interesting opportunities to move the needle in vital regions we haven't talked about, like Latin America, where you're really looking at the end of sort of a left-wing form of authoritarianism, a sort of a left-wing form of dictatorial populism. In Cuba, Raul Castro is very old. In Venezuela, after Chavez, Maduro has never managed to govern this country credibly or competently. You've already seen the pendulum shift in countries like Argentina. In Brazil, the entire political class essentially has been is being renewed and transformed because of this cross-cutting corruption scandal. There are some very interesting stories in Mexico. You have really a key election coming up next year. There are a set of interesting opportunities in Latin America, which really, from an American perspective, this is our backyard and we should care about it a lot. That's one. Two, in the Middle East, I would certainly like to see more democracy, more open society, but really, this is quite interesting. I mean, going back to Jerusalem and Iran, many of the Arab allies, believe it or not, are quite excited by what the Trump administration wants to do in the Middle East, forging a Sunni axis, a Sunni coalition against Iranian power, which they see as having spread its wings too far. And so if you go to a Saudi Arabia or a UAE, they're actually pretty emboldened about the possibilities to reshape the region, and that includes the big Saudi reform efforts, which Tom Friedman himself said was the biggest thing happening in the Arab world, that this was the new Arab Spring, is this big Saudi economic and other opening. So there are some opportunities there. I mentioned Africa, where it's mixed, but there are lots of good news stories. In Europe, the populist tide, I mean, I agree on the dark side, the AfD in Germany and some of these other populists marching closer to the kind of having political effect in parliaments and in politics. But really, you have a good growth story in Europe. You have people like Macron trying to renew the European project. So actually, I don't think things are looking too grim there. I'll stop with Russia. Putin has announced he's going to run again. I don't think we're going to stay up all night waiting for the exit polls to see who wins that one. But, we saw these municipal elections in Russia earlier this year where opposition leaders won in many actual electoral races in Russia, which is not a level playing field at all. What comes after Putin, I think, is an interesting conversation we could have, because none of these people, he'll be, maybe. Maybe. And then in China, you know, there's the great slowdown, the great effort to make the transition, which looks to me like it is stillborn to a certain extent, because Xi Jinping is emphasizing the primacy of politics in the form of strengthening the CCP's monopoly on power. You know, that might have worked in a period of 8, 9, 10% growth. I still have a big question. Does that work when debt to GDP ratios are at about 300%? Does that work kind of when you were trying to make a transition to a technology-based society? I'm not sure it can work.
Sounds interesting. Ellen, anything you might
Well,
want to add?
in the short, you know, if we're taking kind of an 18-month time frame, I think North Korea will continue to be preoccupying for the foreign policy leaders of our country. I think that that is not a, you know, even if the worst case scenario doesn't happen, I think it's still very worrisome, and it does shift our understanding about the basic, you know, dangers of the Asian region. We're not going to talk about bilateral U.S.-Japan relations, but I do think Prime Minister Abe has, like Macron in France, has worked to establish a productive and more positive relationship with the Trump administration, and at the same time, both Japan and France, I would say, have also found more independent room for maneuver for themselves. You know, that by figuring out how to have a somewhat more productive interaction with President Trump compared to some of their regional neighbors, they've also promoted their own national interest and their freedom of maneuver. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic. I think that Russia will remain a source of enormous friction, and I think if we do see Russia rising as displacing the United States in any way in some of the Middle East trouble spots, that's very worrisome, I think, for American influence and ability to try to manage the chronic crises of the Middle East. I am unfortunately less optimistic that values promotion, democracy promotion can be a vital part of the American agenda in the Middle East, both because I'm not sure the Trump administration really believes in it. I mean, they say American values are for Americans, and everybody else has to kind of figure out what their value system is. But also because I think the Arab world is still in enough, disarray or some deep malaise that I don't see any breakthrough or progress there. The Syrian war, for sure, is going into a different phase, and we are in this very awkward situation of saying, kind of, Assad won. Does that mean the U.S. lost? I mean, how do we sort of find a role for ourselves that is that can still promote eventually a political solution? But I think the repercussions of Russia and Iran declaring that, the fighting has stopped, Assad has prevailed, and all these opposition forces, just go back and behave yourselves, that has real consequences for the perception of American influence in the region, unfortunately. And I think we have, Egypt, Libya, there's a lot of other places in the region. I am not as confident that the Great Sunni Alliance, which actually is an idea that almost goes back to the Clinton administration of, the like-minded, moderate, pro-reform, getting Israel and the moderate Sunni states. These are not brand new ideas. These are ideas that we have revisited over the years a number of times. My worry is that it's quite superficial, and it draws us into a logic vis-a-vis Iran that doesn't give us enough diplomatic options vis-a-vis Iran. If we over-identify with the Sunni Arabs' preferences on Iran, it puts a lot of pressure on the United States to take an even more assertive, aggressive approach to Iran, with no guarantee that that will produce the results we want. So I think that there is this danger of drawing us into the Middle East conflicts in a way that doesn't give us the freedom of maneuver to be the external actor that can help rethink the security environment. I'm not convinced that there's yet a strategy that would achieve that. Yeah.
Well, if I'm asked whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic, I'm somewhere in the middle between Dan and Ellen. Unfortunately, Europe, the dark side will stay, at least for a while the Russians are trying to take advantage of that. And without Putin, Russia is another developing nation with much resources, natural resources, and capable of producing weapons alone. And the population is shrinking. So the genius of Putin, Russia may not be a superpower anymore. They can pretend to be so with the help from Mr. Putin. So long live Mr. Putin for the Russians, but well, he will be emperor or tsar forever, I guess, my view. So we have to deal with them. So in order to survive, he interfered in Syria. He might do something similar in North Korea, you never know. So that's a worry about Europe and the Middle East. I echo Ellen, and I'm a bit more pessimistic in a sense because we are still in the process of something we don't understand yet. And I might have told you before, in my view, this is the second phase of the resumption of the collapse of the Middle Eastern portion of the Ottoman Empire. The first time since the 20th century. So the Europeans drew the lines, straight lines, the border demarcation, then they also disappeared, at least between Syria and Iraq. And that triggered the resumption of another collapse or reorientation of the Middle Eastern part of the Ottoman Empire. That means what is in danger? Jordan, I'm sorry to say this, I'm worried about the Gulf. So you never know what's going to happen. So yes, values are important, universal values are important, but probably the people in the Middle East are acting on a different sort of value systems, unfortunately. For Asia, I think our main concern should be China. Of course, North Korea is important, and short term, it will be a big issue. But it will be an episode in the long run. And we have to find the right way to engage and deter the Chinese assertiveness in the long run. And we don't know how to do it. And to be honest, China and Saudi Arabia are doing something similar. They are concentrating power base in order to reform. And which country can reform better? I have no idea. I have no idea. Saudis, good luck. Hopefully they will transform themselves into a great nation. But Chinese may have a better chance of reform. So see what's going to happen.
Great. So I'll leave the rest will go to the question and answer. So first, I'll go to Pacific. There's a mic, so if you can wait until.
Thanks so much. Kristen Olsen, House Report. Thanks for a really great discussion. We crammed a lot. Kuni, I love your Star Wars stuff. Damn. Dan, appreciate your optimism. Alan, thanks for the Middle East especially, because we're all floundering. On North Korea, because that is something we all agree is likely to be the most immediate possible crisis in Asia. The criticism of Tillerson that's coming out of the White House is interesting and important because it's entirely based on news accounts. Clearly, they had not read the speech because the speech was not written out. He gave it from note cards. It was quite remarkable. We finally got the text of the damn thing hours afterwards. And when you read it, you see he did not offer negotiations. He explicitly offered talks about talks to let's see if we could ever get there. That's a really big difference. And he said, if we ever do get there, then of course it's going to be all the stuff. You know, so it tells you a couple of things. One, management of the job requires that messaging doesn't get lost or is misunderstood. So you end up having a fight that's really unnecessary. The fight ought to be about what the hell are we going to do? You know, if Joe Yun comes up with some evidence in his meetings this week that talks might actually be useful, you know, that's what we need to look at. But let's assume we ever do get to negotiations, then, you know, what we're going to be talking about this spring maybe, if we haven't had a war by accident, is what do we do about North Korea as a nuclear power? You know, you get in then the whole freeze debate and all that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to toss that out there. But I think everybody needs to take a deep breath and look at what Tillerson actually said, because what he actually said could lead to negotiations, and that's when you start confronting all these issues. We're not there yet, and we're having a fight that's completely unnecessary.
Yeah, could I just say, it's true that I think that what he was doing was repeating the formula that was used during the Asia trip, including that 60-day pause, that if the North Koreans didn't do anything disruptive in 60 days, then we could envision. So you're right, that he was essentially remembering the formula that they were using during that trip, and not adding anything specifically new.
So I just wanted to address something Kuni said. If you think that North Korea's strategy, Kim Jong-un's strategy, is regime survival, that creates a totally different diplomatic set of options. I don't think it is regime survival, and this administration, I know, does not think it's simply regime survival. Kim Jong-un wants to reunify the Korean Peninsula. He wants to create a security umbrella under which we cannot intervene and under which he thinks he can reunify the Korean Peninsula on his terms. He has a historical sense of himself, like his grandfather, as somebody who's an agent of change. And so this goes from defensive realism to offensive realism and more. If you think he wants to reunify the Korean Peninsula, obviously all elements need to be on the table, including diplomacy, including military power, but I'm afraid one becomes much less optimistic about the chances for a peaceful resolution, because this is how I think we assess he sees his historical role. And that should be most alarming to all of our friends and to us, because the status quo will not hold, given North Korea's dramatic enhancements in weaponization.
Kevin, you had a, if you can wait until microphone so that the recording can.
Follow up on that. In terms of the U.S.-Japan alliance, it's functioning well. The leadership supported such a deep relationship. Supported by the alliance. It's going to survive Takayama. Will survive Trump. So I agree. In terms of,
I like your optimism.
it's very dangerous in terms of if the U.S. is seen as weak in terms of its leadership, its abilities. I think it's a very dangerous situation. So what concerns me is, at the moment, in terms of North Korea, Trump is running the risk of making a mistake that Obama made in Syria in terms of redlining some chemical weapons. You know, bluster is never really good in diplomacy unless you're willing to act on your bluster. You don't make threats that you're not willing to carry out. You destroy credibility. So my question, particularly to you, is if the U.S. goes down the road of talks with three nations, which ultimately would lead to tolerating North Korea having a nuclear weapon, I don't see any other way negotiations will work out. From my perspective, would be a mistake. But if that's the road the U.S. takes, what's the view of Japan? Do you still see the United States as a reliable partner? How do you think Beijing and North Korea and the Russians and the South Koreans see the U.S. in terms of being a reliable partner?
Tough question. So your question is, what if the United States acquiesce the North Korean nuclear weapon? Well, that's another nightmare. You know, going to war is one nightmare, and acquiesce is a second nightmare for us and for the South Koreans as well. But and I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to think about it. But if you insist that I have to say something about it, I would tell myself, okay, this is nothing new. It happened to Europe in the 80s. You remember the SS-20 Pershing II sort of a debate on decoupling. Okay, decoupling issue has been there and will be there. Will be here. And finally, it came to East Asia. Okay, so Europeans live with that. And if that's the only choice we have to survive. We have to live with that. But with how we do that, probably South Koreans might start talking about the reintroduction of tactical nuclear weapons, for example, on their soil. And the next question is, what about Japan? And my answer is probably no, although some Japanese politicians started talking about that possibility, or possibility of revising one of the 3 non-nuclear principles of introduction of nuclear weapons. I am personally skeptical. Going nuclear or even introducing American tactical nuclear weapons in Japan is, first of all, number one, is not going to change the nuclear deterrence posture or effectiveness. Secondly, if we go nuclear, then from the purely military point of view or economic point of view, or political point of view, it's not worthwhile.
It's not what?
Not worthwhile to do, in my view. I may be, people may disagree, but for the lack of strategic depth of my country, despite the probably technical possibility or capability is there, technological capability might be there, but I would say if there's any merit of discussing the nuclear option for Japan, that is, the discussion itself is a deterrence, okay? But nothing more than that. I don't think that really going nuclear is probably much more counterproductive than productive.
Any reaction to what Kuni says finally before we wrap this up? Ellen or Dave?
I don't think we have an option to fall back into a long-term kind of contain and deter policy given the offensive ambitions of the North Korean regime. And I think, again, that this administration is very focused on not putting in place a long-term posture, but really trying to crack this, you know, hopefully through diplomacy, right? I would say one more thing, which is that the sanctions net on North Korea today is still a lot looser than the sanctions net that was placed around Iran that delivered the Iranian nuclear deal. The sanctions net is much more porous, and there is a lot our friends could do all over the world, including in Europe, not just in Asia. There is a lot more they could do. And this administration, of course, has made this a big push.
But I think eventually Iran cared enough. Iran is a bigger country. The people are more mobile. That the incentive structure, it did actually work, sanctions. I don't think it was the only reason, but I think that Iran cared about the price it was paying. North Korea, where the economic connections to the outside world are really just for the regime and not for the people, so we have to not assume that the pattern is going to be exactly the same as it was with Iran. But on the question of whether the Republic of Korea or Japan or even Taiwan would, you know, consider developing their own nuclear programs, my understanding is that President Trump made some, you know, casual reference to this before being inaugurated, and that he has not repeated that gesture as if that casual remark that, oh, maybe they should, you know, maybe that's the way that, and I think there's a reimposition of a little more discipline. That would be a very, you know, unfavorable development in our view, and that there's some, you know, sort of revalidation of extended deterrence as an alternative to these countries developing their own nuclear programs. But, you know, we are very, you know, we send mixed signals because we have not been consistent in sort of delegitimizing nuclear weapons. On this stage just a week ago, there was a discussion about this nuclear ban treaty, the new treaty to ban nuclear weapons. And, you know, the U.S. wants a little bit to say that the original nuclear powers have some distinct responsibilities and that we really still do believe in trying to stop any further, you know, expansion of which are the nuclear weapon states. So I agree with Kuni that I hope that in the bilateral dialogue there would be a very strong preference to not go down that route. Yeah.
Well, thank you all. I think this was a fascinating discussion, and I'm just very happy that no one talked about helicopter crash incident in Okinawa 2 days ago. So if you can join me in thanking the 3 wonderful speakers for this morning, and thank you for coming.